So hello everyone and welcome to a vlog that we're running today. So Imagineer has done a series of vlogs and we've had a little bit of a break for a couple of months, but we have been inspired and prompted to do our next vlog. And this is a team vlog, so I'll ask Joe and Sarah to introduce themselves in a second. But what prompted us was the recent publication that came out actually on the 26th of January this year on discharge from mental health inpatient settings. And the content of this document really resonated with us as a team. And we wanted to create an opportunity to share the work that we do and how it feeds into the overall guidance that the government's recently published. So today's vlog is all about what we bring as a team to help to meet the guidance that's been set within this new document. But before we go any further, Joe, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. So I'm Joe Alexander, and I think this is the first vlog I've recorded with the Imagineer team. So really excited to be here today.
Thanks, Joe. And Sarah?
Hi everybody, I'm Sarah and I'm also part of the core team at Imagineer. I'm one of the directors and you probably have seen me if you've watched any of our previous vlogs talking with Liz to lots of our really great guests. So hopefully this one's going to be interesting for you to listen to as well. And it's great to have Joe with us today.
Yeah, fantastic. So we'll get into a bit of the nuts and bolts of the conversation in a second. But for those who haven't heard of Imagineer, we've been around for 15 years. We're a social enterprise, so we have got a social mission as an asset-locked organisation. And our real purpose is about bringing hope, helping people to feel hopeful about their future, to support people to identify their purpose, and to encourage and create the conditions for people to feel confident about taking action towards the future that they wish to have. And we do that using a whole range of different techniques: person-centered planning, support brokerage, we do training around life planning. So we've utilised a whole range of different approaches. And built into that is our knowledge as well around life coaching and neuro-linguistic programming aspect of life coaching as well. So let's take a bit of a dive into this then, because there was 8 principles, isn't there, in the new guidance that we want to talk through. And the first one here, so that I'll read out to you, so you're getting this word for word actually from the guidance paper. The person should be at the centre of planning for their own discharge and care and treatment plans that support this. And what matters most to them should be understood and recorded. So what's really coming through in that principle, we've had planning for discharge for a long time, haven't we? That's actually not anything particularly new. And the different elements of that discharge, whether it's care and treatment plans or the various other elements that's considered as part of discharge. But what really stands out there is what matters most to the person should be understood and recorded. And that's the bit that's the additional part that comes through in the guidance. And as I've already mentioned, one of the founding principles for Imagineer is around person-centered planning, is about making sure that plans are focused around the person, that the person has control over their plan, what it says in their plan, what the future aspirations are. And for anybody that's followed Imagineer for a while, you know that one of the taglines that we have, one of the things we quite often refer to, is a person being in the driving seat of their own life. So as we hold that principle so strongly at Imagineer, it goes hand in hand that when we're working alongside people, we absolutely focus in on the experience for the person in making sure that their plan is definitely theirs. And to encourage an approach to planning that isn't just about the diagnosis or the label or what's been identified as a need or a treatment plan, but it's really holistic. Who am I? What's important to me? How do I want to live? What does a good life look like for me? Where do I want to be spending my time? Who with? So we take a really broad view of planning around that good life piece as well, don't we? So can
Definitely.
you, Joe and Sarah, have you got any kind of examples of planning work that we've done that really helps to demonstrate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably one of the first things to mention is if people are coming across us for the first time and they perhaps haven't heard of support brokerage before, or really looked into the detail of the work that we do at Imagineer, support brokerage is probably quite a good place to start. So we have a team of support brokers at Imagineer, and the whole team are trained in support brokerage. And actually, support brokerage training is something we offer externally to people who want to develop those skills and approaches for themselves in their own practice as well. So support brokers bring a whole range of different techniques, skills, and approaches and knowledge to their practice. And some people will come from a specific area of practice or professionalism or accreditation. So support brokers can be people who trained as nurses or occupational therapists, for example. We quite often talk to people who are social prescribers or community connectors by background. So all of those, what we would call strengths-based approaches, which are focused on the strengths that surround the person's gifts and their skills and their interests and the strong relationships that surround them and how they're connected into their local community. Those are the things that form the basis of the support broker relationship. And quite critically, the support broker is an independent party in that process. So unlike other professionals that are involved in hospital discharge, support brokers act very neutrally and independently. So they're very distinctly separate from the other agencies, and particularly those professionals who would hold a statutory role or function within the discharge process. So quite often, if there's a Mental Health Act framework provisions around the person's discharge, that's all triggered by the statutory frameworks and requirements in the process. But the support broker is able to work outside of that. So we don't have a statutory role. It means that we can get involved at any point in the process. And it also means that we don't have to wait for our input to be triggered at a stage of the process for us to become involved. So it means we have more flexibility and freedom to gather information, to talk to all the people that are involved around the person, and to really get a strong sense of the essence of the person. So we can do that really great discovery work that's involved. I call it gold digging for gold, treasure hunting, finding out about the person, so that we've got that really strong sense of what matters most and what's important to them, which is what's referred to in the guidance. What about you, Jo? What are you thinking about in response to this principle?
I think that a lot of the stuff around understanding and recording people is what draws me in. So coming up with plans that make sense to the person in a style that makes sense to them, and not expecting a template to be given out. Lots of times we hear, can you send me your template for a life plan? And the answer is there isn't one. It's as individual as the person. And trying to get professionals, particularly in hospital discharge, to understand some of that is quite difficult. There are time pressures when you're working on a ward, without a doubt. And often so much is seen as kind of just need to get it done. And going in as a support broker, as you said, Sarah, kind of being independent, having time with people to understand what matters to them, but also to record it in a way that kind of makes sense to them. And if we think about some of the work that we've seen recently in producing life plans and support plans for people in a variety of ways, in styles and themes, in colours, in kind of methods, whether it's printed, whether it's visual, whether it's recorded, but it is in a way that makes sense to the person. And I guess that's the strongest point for me in that principle.
Yeah, I was just thinking about those really nice creative elements that come into play with the planning work that we do, and how the broker can really draw on their experience and their skills and their initiative in working alongside a whole range of different people, and actually really kind of home in on what really draws the person's engagement and interest. So, we work with a lot of people who have a trauma history, particularly when it comes to hospitals and health professionals and institutional settings. And they're really closed off and anxious about sharing information about themselves or entering into a dialogue that could lead to something happening to them that is not in their control. And one of the great things that support brokers can do is meet the person where they're at without any kind of a statutory wrapping around that or a professional kind of glaze to what we do. So just thinking of a lovely example I heard about recently from one member of our team was she was going in to do some work with a lady who was in hospital and developing a life plan alongside her. And And the lady was quite resistant to talking about anything really personal or sensitive initially. But the support broker learned that she loved Disney. She really loved Disney characters. And so, really simple thing, but she went out, she bought a Disney magazine with Disney characters in, and she took that into her meeting with the person in hospital. And the magazine formed the focus for the conversation. But out of that conversation came a whole set of plans, which were Disney focused. But it was a translation into the language of the person that enabled them to talk about what was important to them in a way that felt safe and was fun for them. They created a poster, they mapped out all of their important relationships using Disney characters, and they did the quiz that was in the magazine with the support broker as a way of kind of breaking the ice and relaxing a little bit into the conversation. So that's a really nice example of a creative approach that can be used for us to learn about the person and then record what's important to them from those conversations.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the most important things, isn't it? Starting with a blank sheet of paper and for every plan to take a shape and take a form that's completely unique. Not to have an approach where every plan in some way looks the same or is pre-formatted in any way. And I think the one thing we begin to appreciate through our approach and the work that we do is how the relationship changes for the person whose plan it is. And, you know, when someone's been through a process approach to planning, and one that's like a service-based approach to planning, sometimes the relationship between the person and their own plan can feel quite distant. Whereas, you know, when you've got the approach to planning right, when the person's sense of ownership over their own plan is really increased, and that's achieved through the approach that's used in that plan, you know, in developing that plan. And just examples that we've had of people that have taken the plan with them all over to show them to different people and to take to different meetings. And actually it's the person themselves that's driven that sharing of the plan. It's not being driven by a professional, it's being driven by the person. And when the person leaves hospital and the plan is still theirs, and then they're sharing the plan with the new people that they're meeting in the life, in the community. And that's a real, for me, that really begins to demonstrate whether we have really achieved that person-centered approach when the person recognizes and relates to that plan as theirs.
Yeah, there's something really strong about that ownership, isn't there? When the person recognizes it's theirs because they've developed it alongside the person working with them, and that belongs to them. They can share that with the people they choose to share it with. It's really powerful stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about it from the person's perspective, in the hospital, there's so many different assessments, there's so many different plans that are done from the various professionals that are involved, that actually to be able to distinguish all this range of documentation that's developed through the hospital process. And how do you relate to all of that? There's a lot that's professionally led within that work, and this is where we can bring an approach to planning that goes beyond that and goes to a much wider view. We were talking about it earlier today, actually, about how you've got a needs-led approach, you've got a diagnosis-led approach, but then you've got and that's all embedded in the medical model, isn't it? But if you take a citizenship-led approach, which is embedded in the social model of disability, we begin to have conversations and we begin to relate to each other on a much wider level than the label, the diagnosis and the treatment plans. And it goes much broader about really what life means for all of us, What does a good home look like? How do we have something where we're contributing something to the community that really matters to us and other people? How are we recognised? How are we valued? And like you were saying earlier, Sarah, on that whole asset-based, strengths-based approach.
Definitely. Should we move on to principle 2 then?
Yeah, let's have a look at that one.
So from the guidance again, principle 2 says chosen carers should be involved in the discharge process as early as possible. So, I mean, this is a really great opportunity for us to talk about the foundations of person-centered planning work and how we work alongside people from the beginning in an independent capacity, but with an understanding that the person will direct us. They are in the driving seat and they will direct us as support brokers as to who they would like to have involved in their planning. And one of the early pieces of work we would always do as support broker is recognizing the person's important and significant relationships, both family, friends, unpaid carers, neighbours, and anybody else who's in their life on a regular basis who actually has an investment in the well-being of that person. From a relational perspective, not from a paid perspective. But we also do recognise the team of professionals around the individual. I think the key thing when we're looking at it from a citizenship lens, as Liz was describing, is that we're not just looking at what we do in a professional paid context around the person. So we're thinking about the person in a whole life context, and any interventions that are happening now as a result of them being in hospital, and perhaps any community-based support they'll receive when they leave hospital, is only one stage of that process. It's only one part of their needs for support and their whole life. So it's really important we don't focus all of our conversations and thinking and solutions and planning just around what paid support and what statutory involvement is available to the person. And so that whole concept of the chosen carers, which is the language in the guidance, is really important, because these are the long-term relationships or the sustainable relationships in the future, which are going to help ensure the well-being of the person once they're living back in the community again. And those relationships are really, really key. They help to make introductions to new opportunities. They help people to develop skills and become more resilient. They help people to feel confident. And it's really, really important that those key people are on board from the beginning of that process. So we're not having to catch them up after all the planning's been done and then backpedal because some really important insights that they can offer have not been considered as part of that planning process. So one of the things we do, we reach into the toolkit of person-centered planning tools. We may use one of the more formal facilitated processes to do planning work with the person, but we're always looking for tools that are going to help us to learn about those important people in the person's life, and then have a dialogue with the person who is in the driving seat of the process to ask how they would like those carers to be involved in that planning work. And it may be that they help us to do some of the actual implementation around discharge support as well. But the critical thing to consider in that is that the person is in the driving seat of how and when and how much they're involved. So it's not about professionals identifying who the person's chosen carers are. It's about the person telling us who they would like to have involved. And there's lots of other things that we do in our work as brokers, isn't there, around making sure that those conversations are being held regularly with the important people in the person's life. And maybe Liz or Joe, you want to talk into how support brokers can help to join up those conversations and bring that information together, because that's a really critical part of what we do here at Imagineer, isn't it?
Do you want to pick up, Joe?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll pick up on that one. Yeah, I think often being able to talk to people outside of a hospital setting just allows us to also understand where the person's strengths are. You know, being in hospital is very disabling for the most part. People get lots of rights taken away from them, lots of freedom taken away from them. And to understand how the person chose to live their life before being in a hospital setting allows you to kind of lean into where their strengths are, the cliched saying of what is strong as opposed to what is wrong, and kind of understanding how that person might want to use that to plan their future life, I think is always really important. But understanding from the person themselves around who those chosen carers are, as the guidance says. It's not the best language, but we'll use the words of chosen carers, because they might not be the people that you think. They might not be mum and dad or brother and sister. It might actually be somebody who's just a friend who has been supporting an individual, you know, through a difficult time and has an understanding of what life could look like for them in a better setting. And often those are the bits that get missed, aren't they? If you go to a ward round and the professional team is saying, well, mum and dad need to be involved, or there's a sibling, or there's a, you know, a nominated person who is the person we talk to about this individual, but hearing from the individual themselves about who is important to them, and getting that bit right, obviously, is crucial to understanding what the discharge could look like for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I think that whole thing about language is really pertinent here. You know, although this guidance has come through and 26th of January 2024, there's still language in the guidance that really is professionalizing something that should be about whole life. And for me, if we was to rewrite this from a everyday life community perspective, chosen carers would be the people who love and care about you. And that is significantly different. You know, chosen carers from a professional perspective could easily be misinterpreted as those people that are paid to care for you in your life. It could be easily misinterpreted in people that are in a paid role. Whereas what we see and what we're reading here is we're actually talking about the people that love and care for the person from a very genuine place. And like you said, Jo, that, you know, the relationships aren't always about your immediate response, maybe mum and dad, but it might not be. It might be the next door neighbour. It might be the person that I went to watch football with when I was out of hospital. It might be the person that I went to play pool with. You know, the people that love and care, we can't predetermine who they are. They need to be determined by the person, by having that really encouraging, open, everyday conversation. And we know that the real difference is made in relationship. The real difference in quality of life is made in the relationships that we have around us. And that's where the real difference is made. And there's been a couple of times when, in our experience, where we've been working alongside people who have been admitted into hospital, and there's been a breakdown in relationships because those who do love and care about the person feels quite distressed about being with the person in that environment. It's very difficult for people who do genuinely love and care to be alongside somebody who's in that position, and especially to be alongside someone if they don't feel included. If they're being involved in meetings where the language is so professional, they don't understand what's going on, where the space isn't created for people to make a valuable contribution into the conversations because it's taken over by those who've got a professional perspective. So it's absolutely key that it's not just about identifying people, not the predetermined people, but the people that really do matter. But when people are invited to be involved, they're invited to be involved in a way that's meaningful for them as well, so that their contributions are heard and valued within that process. And we know, don't we, that, you know, sometimes the breakdown of relationships happen. Those that do love and care have sometimes told us that they don't feel included, they don't feel valued, they don't know how they can contribute, they don't know what difference that they can make. But ultimately, the overall aim is for the person to be out of hospital. And when somebody is out of hospital, the relationships that will remain and sustain are those people that love and care for the person from a genuine point of view. So
And
we've got to make
actually,
yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and actually, they're the people who will make a difference between whether the person goes back into crisis and ends at a position of needing to be readmitted to hospital as well, which sadly we do see where the support is not right for the person in the community after their discharge. So this whole concept of planning involving the important people around the person is so critical, because it makes that difference between the person staying well and staying out of hospital or hitting crisis because they don't have that network of support around them and then ending up having to go back into hospital again. So it really does make sense, but it's also just the right thing to do. And for any of us, if we found ourselves in a position where we were admitted to a mental health inpatient unit, we would absolutely want to have the people who are most invested in us involved in planning for us to be back in our home community again and making sure that we're okay. So it's just absolutely a principle of good citizenship and living a good life, isn't it? Really, really
absolutely.
critical.
And
Should
it
we
is
move on to?
concerning.
Oh, sorry, Liz.
Yeah, I was just going to say it is concerning when you hear perspectives within MDT meetings and ward rounds where people involved from a professional perspective give the opinion that they don't think it's the right thing for family or relationships outside of the hospital to be present in them MDT, the multidisciplinary team meetings or the ward round meetings. And I think that's a culture and a habit that fundamentally needs to change to embed principle too. And just like you were saying, Sarah, moving away from somebody moving out of hospital into community. But what we sometimes find is without it being done from a relational perspective, people find themselves living in mini institutions. It's still a service in the community.
And very isolated often still as well. Yeah.
So it's the loved ones that really pivot the change from being from a hospital into a mini institution placement in the community to moving from hospital back to life in community. It is significantly different. So yeah, an important one.
Very important. So,
Shall we look at
Jo, do you want to pick up?
Yeah. Shall we move on? So we've got another 5 to get through. So principle 3 talks about discharge planning, and it says discharge planning should start on admission or before and should take place throughout the time the person is in hospital. So it sounds really simple, this one, doesn't it? It sounds like a really logical thing to do. From the minute someone is admitted into hospital, should be planning for their discharge. And does it happen? Well, I think probably not. And that's why we end up with people who've been in hospital for a number of years in some cases before discharge is really considered. So when we talk about people identified under the red section of the Dynamic Support Register, so the list that local authorities hold of people who've got particularly complex needs, who are living in community settings and maybe at risk of admission to an inpatient setting. The allocation of a support broker can ensure continuity of discharge planning or prevention, as we would like to see much more often, conversations and actions, and a central point of coordination for the MDT, so the multidisciplinary team that Liz was mentioning earlier. And I think, Sarah, you touched on support brokerage not having a statutory function, not being triggered by a certain point in the process. So there isn't a point that we could say, oh, now this person should be eligible for support brokerage, or this is the point at which we should consider this coming in. But actually being responsive to the person's circumstances, and starting at any point of that kind of discharge planning or the hospital journey at all for them, really, to bring together those conversations that look towards discharge planning, keeping people focused on the fact that life should be outside of hospital, and that living in hospital shouldn't be something that we consider for people. And I know we see people spending years and years in hospitals, and those are the cases that always hit the news, aren't they, in terms of this person has spent 5, 6, 7, 10 years. I'm supporting someone currently who spent a number of years in hospital when actually over the course of their life has spent more time in hospital than they've spent outside of hospital. And that's a pretty sad statistic for people, really, particularly as we approach this 2024, and we've still got people living in hospital for long sections of their lives, because community services don't seem to be able to provide the support that people need. And maybe that leans into the conversation about mini institutions, Liz, there, and what that looks like for people outside of hospital.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you look at Principle 3 and you read it over a few times, you think, this isn't new. This is not a new idea. In fact, it's actually part of the Mental Health Act Code of Practice, and it forms part of the care programme approach process, which anybody who is admitted to hospital under the Mental Health Act should be subject to a care programme approach, or CPA as it's often shortened to, process. They'll have a care coordinator allocated who is responsible for overseeing the care programme approach process. And the guidelines dictate in the Code of Practice that discharge planning should start straight away. Now, we know from our practice and our experience, particularly for people with learning disabilities and autistic people who find themselves subject to Mental Health Act framework hospital admissions, they're often in a hospital setting that is not a specialist setting for learning disability or autism. So one of the first things that can happen is the person's identified behaviours of concern or their risks or the reasons for admission actually become heightened in that psychiatric setting because it's not suited to their needs. The environment is not suited to their needs, can be very triggering and traumatic for the person. And actually then we hit this cycle of the person becoming more risky to work with, more risky to find a community placement for, more difficult to provide or find a specialist provider to provide support for. And it becomes a cycle of the person just getting stuck because they're stuck in an institutional system and process which really doesn't work for them. And one of the things that we see as support brokers is often this whole kind of conversation about let's be proactive and preventative rather than waiting until we hit crisis and then panicking that we've got to get a solution in place. It just doesn't seem to happen. One of the things with support brokers is that we have from the very start of working with somebody, we have a preventative, proactive mindset towards working with the person. It's very strengths focused, it's very solution focused, but it's about understanding what a good life looks like for the person so that we can create solutions that fit with that. And in theory, if you do that, the person doesn't hit crisis because they've got the right environment and the right support around them. So the idea of allocating a support broker to the process as early as possible, they can bring all of that skill set and that knowledge around the Mental Health Act and other legal frameworks, the Care Act framework, for example, and also an understanding of how personal health budgets work and all of the other things that we need to know about for discharge planning, 117 aftercare, for example, and then all of the other interventions and therapeutic support that needs to be around the person, as well as what are the opportunities, how can they get reconnected into their community again, how can we start to help them build those really enduring relationships that we've been talking about. All of that stuff happens through coordination, doesn't it? And the support broker can play that really key role in coordinating all of those ideas, all of those conversations, all of that exploration that needs to happen. Perhaps other members of the multidisciplinary team don't have time for. They don't have time to go and do the exploration. They don't have time often to go at the pace of the person to get to know them. So they have to make quick assumptions often rather than doing the work and spending the time of getting it right, because the statutory processes and the pressure on beds often in hospitals, or the pressure on getting people out into the community because of getting numbers down in terms of hospital admissions, all of that stuff is all creating this melting pot of things not going very well for the person. And it's the person in the middle that is most affected by all this stuff. So the broker can really help to unravel some of that stuff, can't they? And really start to step back and think, what does good look like for this individual person right now? And how can we, using all of the knowledge we have around funding and housing and accommodation options and building the right support around the person, how can we pull that together in a plan that really makes sense for the person to stay well out of a hospital setting, and live a great life as well? It's not just about existence, not just about staying out of hospital, it's about living really well as a citizen, isn't it? So I really love that support brokers aren't attached to a statutory function or a legal framework. They can work in that really flexible and creative way to make sure that the solutions and the plan that is developed really make sense for the person. Is there anything else we could throw in around some of the work we've been doing around that recently? Like getting in at an early stage to do that really good creative planning work.
Yeah, I think some of it's about bridging the gap between inpatient settings and community, isn't it? So you'll look at the way in which systems work. They work in silos very much. The ward do within these four walls of our hospital building. This is what we do to provide care and support to somebody. And the community resources, whether that's a provider, whether it's family, whether it's community assets, all of those are existing on the outside of the hospital setting, and the two don't really mix. And then you know, we rock up as support brokers and actually do exactly that. So we do both. So we'll cross the bridge between community and hospital settings. We'll take what's understood in the hospital, bring that back to a community set and say, this is what it needs to look like. Or we'll understand what how the person was choosing to live before a hospital admission. Is that how they see their best life? Bring that into the hospital and say, actually, have you thought about doing some of these things? And we've seen examples where people have had really limited access to community activities, as it tends to be termed, so being able to get outside of a hospital, and brokers have gone in and said, actually, have you not thought about some of this stuff? This person tells me they really enjoyed this certain activity, this pastime, this sport, whatever it might be, going shopping for new clothes, Liz, and being able to go out and do some of those things, and it's just, I guess, bridging that gap between kind of community and hospital settings that feels like a really important part of the support brokerage role.
Yeah. I think there's only a couple of things that contribute in there then, because I mean, what that covers it, doesn't it? What we've spoke about there absolutely shines that lens onto how the approach we bring is so different to a lot of how things are already done. I think there's just two areas that I think are really important to draw out as well. One of them is how we really draw on the principles of working alongside the person. So we don't approach doing planning by going and doing a plan for someone. We do a plan with someone and alongside them. We have conversations in such a way that really encourage the person, the circle of support around them, to think openly, think differently, think about possibilities, think positively about the future. And we know when we've really engaged someone, really kind of fired someone up and brought that perspective that things are possible for the future. When we go back to see them or we have a follow-up conversation with them and they've continued to do the planning themselves, even if it's on the thinking, it might not be written down, it might not be drawn, it might not be something they've looked on a laptop or an iPad to get some information about. It's just that they're starting to bring things into the conversation that really shows that they're thinking about this. They're really thinking about what they want the life to be about, and they're starting to really bring in things so that they're doing their own planning in a sense. We're just helping to facilitate their own plan, and that's a significant difference. And I think the only other thing is some of the unplanning we have to do. So when there's been so many professional plans done in the past, sometimes the people around the person are led by the plans that have been historically written and not led by where the person is right now in the life. So, you know, sometimes some of them plans about somebody's life can contain some negative stuff about periods in the life that haven't been good, but the person still is related to on a basis of how they were at that time in the life and not how they are right now. So what we sometimes have to do is do a little bit of unplanning, because when it comes to life outside hospital, if the person's surrounded by people who have a steer on that or have some kind of control over what that could look like, that steer and that control can be really influenced by the person's reputation that they hold from a historical incident or historical thing that happened in the life, not how they are right now. And we've had instances, haven't we, where we've had to have really challenging, difficult conversations with groups of people around, can we unthink some of this? Can we change our perspective of this person so that collectively we can work for a better future?
Definitely. Do you want to move on to principle 4 now, Liz?
Yeah. Am I reading this one out?
Yeah.
Okay, so principle 4. Health and local authority social care partners should support people to be discharged in a timely and safe way as soon as they are clinically ready to leave the hospital. So as we know, when someone's in a hospital setting, dependent what section they're in the hospital setting under, there'll be clinical oversight, and the responsible clinician will use their professional expertise, use their approaches around assessing the person's response to the therapeutic input they're receiving in the hospital setting, and will in some way determine when they believe the person's ready for discharge. And so we have a range of different meetings that help to feedback on that, and for MDTs, multidisciplinary teams to come together to have conversations around that. And we know that, I think you touched on this earlier, Sarah, that this whole position within the Mental Health Act around, we need to start working from the point of discharging as soon as a person's admitted into hospital. So we know that with all the guidance and with all the legislation we're working in, that point of let's make sure discharge happens in a timely way is there as a core principle. But that core principle in practice sometimes doesn't happen. It's not facilitated in that way. And that can be because there's contradictory opinions around the person's readiness for discharge. It can be that they're actually, where is this person going to be discharged to? So there can be a blockage in the sense that their perspective is there isn't anywhere for this person to go. What we tend to find is that happens, especially when people are looking for a service for the person to go to, rather than looking at building a life that the person wants to have outside the hospital. It's not all about the service, it's about having the life that the person wants to have. And that means having to explore a whole range of options around where is home and what does home look like, and where do we find that and how do we make that possible? What does good support look like, and where can support come from? Is it all paid? Does there need to be any therapeutic input? What can be readily available in the community that the person can connect in with? And although we have the first two generally in place, the service response, the support response, the community response, one that quite often gets overlooked quite more often than anything else is, well, what support is readily available in the community that the person can link into. So we kind of help to bring a widening. I think one of the things that we bring as support brokers into them meetings and into them conversations is a widening of perspective. And we bring assurances and confidence that although the ideas that are generated in them conversations may be very unusual and not the usual response to somebody in this situation, we can bring the assurances that it is possible and we can make this happen. Not only by being able to bring some of the solutions and some of the thinking that helps to build these approaches, but by demonstrating and reflecting on what we've done in the past. You know, we've done this before, it's worked really well, and this can happen for this person too, you know. Yeah, so, and we do within the work that we do, I think you touched on this earlier, Sarah, around how in a sense we kind of sometimes do act as coordinators, but one of the key things that we really focus on is not duplicating what team members are already doing. So there is care coordinators, there is key workers, there is responsible clinicians, there's a whole range of people fulfilling roles around the person. What we don't aim to do is duplicate that role. What we aim to do is provide the glue to bring them roles together and help to work towards making something happen that might be different to what's been done before. So,
and it is that lovely, I can't remember who said it might have been Joe, the idea of bridging. So
yes.
between the inpatient setting and the community outside the hospital, and by doing that, you know, often care coordinators focus on clinical interventions and statutory or service provision as the only things that they focus on in their planning work and in their coordination work, whereas the broker will do the glue around all of the community options and the community solutions and the housing and the accommodation solutions that the person needs, and all the other little bits that are going to help make that plan work really well for the person to have a good life. Because often, I mean, we know, don't we, from practice and experience, that often the thing that really makes it work is the wraparound support. that is provided, particularly in the early weeks and months of the person leaving hospital, so that if anything starts to look a little bit shaky or wobbly, there is that link still back into the team of professionals who are able to maybe step up some of that intervention work or that therapeutic work for a period of time, or the commissioners who may need to flex the budget for the persons of support, the budget for the person's support for a period of time, just until things have stabilized. And so it's that dynamic, responsive conversation that needs to keep happening, isn't it? When we're talking about coordination, it is that kind of the dynamic, responsive kind of, we're here and we're still involved, and we can really quickly bring people together again and raise those questions and those concerns, and also put out on the table, we've already explored what some of the solutions might be. Can we chat about it? Can we come up with a collective plan that's really going to work, so the person doesn't have to come back to hospital again? So that's really critical, isn't it?
Absolutely. I guess it's worth mentioning there as well about how the approach to support brokerage really encourages people to think beyond the usual commissioning approved provider framework practices, so that a broader range of ideas and potential solutions can be explored. And it kind of means that we're moving away from a way of setting up and designing services that's largely orientated around a cost structure, like whether a service can come in at a certain value or a certain price, to actually an approach that the design is based on whether this is going to work for this person and why it will work for this person, and how it'll be set up and managed in such a way that it will help them with their next stage of their life in a much more positive, safe, productive way. And it's an interesting dilemma sometimes to get into with at that stage with the commissioner conversation, because sometimes on the offset, them designs may appear a little bit more expensive at the offset, but when you then future track the way it's working, it's reducing the possibility of readmission to hospital. The staff team more often are retained over a long period of time, so the recruitment costs are vastly reduced. And we don't end up in a situation where a provider gives back to a commissioner, because what the provider realises after 6 months is they can't possibly provide the support at the original cost that they'd given. So it's that element of sustainability as well, and long-term planning. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts, Jo, on
Principle 4, yeah, I think the big thing is around partners, isn't it? So it says health and local authority social care partners. So working together, and I know this leads into Principle 5, Sarah, so I'm not going to say too much because it will cut into your speech. But the idea, again, back to the fact that hospitals and community services seems to work in silos rather than actually working together to get the best outcomes for people, is really clear in this principle, and saying that people should be partnering up as opposed to actually just saying, well, we're the hospital setting, so we're going to do this, and a community setting saying, well, we're going to do something different, and not understanding how actually working together. And that leads into your flexing budget, Sarah, in terms of if somebody is struggling a little bit, can we reach into a hospital team to get some expertise? Can we reach in to understand what happens rather than that going to an admission? And I guess that doesn't happen currently very often, does it? It's very much a silo at the moment. But that probably leads you into Principle 5. So
yeah, so I mean, there is quite a bit of overlap, isn't there? And I think probably we've already said quite a bit towards Principle 5, but I'll read it out and then we can just unpick it a little bit. So Principle 5 says there should be ongoing communication between hospital teams and community services involved in onward care during the admission and post-discharge. So we have leaned into that quite a lot already in what we've been saying. I think some of the bits I'd like to pick up on there are around, again, where the support broker can really provide that glue in those conversations, in bringing people together. The partnerships that Jo's just referencing really kind of leans towards a shared risk-taking approach. So, we can provide some really great individual designed supports and accommodation solutions for people who are getting stuck in hospital, because the block is often around commissioning and availability of suitable accommodation and support provider solutions for the person. That's why they're getting stuck. It's not because they're not ready to leave hospital, it's because there's nowhere for them to go, or nobody who is suitably skilled in being able to provide support when the person leaves hospital. So this idea of bringing everyone together in a shared risk conversation. Okay, so this might be a little bit outside of what we normally do, but let's look at an individual solution for this person. And if it looks a bit shaky in the early weeks, let's get around the table together again and talk about how we can all rally to make sure that this doesn't fall to pieces. So there is that, instead of, as Joe was referencing, not working in silos. So if commissioners around the table, clinicians around the table, a support provider is around the table, maybe a representative from a housing association or a landlord is linked into that conversation. Everybody shares the risk that is perceived about what might happen when this person leaves hospital if it goes wrong, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And that might include looking at some of those horrible things that Liz was alluding to earlier that are in the person's history. You know, a lot of people we work alongside may have what's called a forensic risk history, where they've perhaps committed an index offence in their past at some point, you know. And we have worked with people perhaps who have an index offence of something like arson, where they've set something on fire. And actually, when you read it, it sounds horrific, but it might be something really simple, like they were trying to light a candle with a match and the match didn't work, so they went and lit it on their gas cooker instead, and then, you know, the house set on fire. And then, you know, it could be something simple like that. Sometimes it's more serious, but that is carried into the person's plan forevermore as a risk, you know. And a housing provider would look at that straight away and go, they can't, you know, we can't offer this person a tenancy, it's too much of a risk. If they burn the building down, all of their neighbours are going to be at risk as well, you know. So there's this idea that if we don't together collectively plan around risk and understand how we can mitigate it, what great solutions can we come up with so that's not a problem, you know. So maybe we don't have a gas cooker in the person's kitchen, maybe we have an induction hob, for example, and maybe we put some isolator switches in. So we can look at loads of really great assisted technology solutions that enable the environment to be right for the person, so they can live as independently as possible in their own home, with their own front door, with really good support around them that enables them to live a great life, but actually stops this constant label going round and round of risky, that stops the person being able to live as a citizen in their community. So yeah, I think for me, my highlight in this one would be around the partnership, around the communication. It's around agreed shared risk taking and shared ownership of the plans and commissioning solutions and all of the things that need to be in place around the person when they're in the community, so that there's that continuous dialogue happening around what do we need to flex here? How do we need to just be a little bit more creative or shift that a little bit so that it carries on working for the person really well? And part of that as well, from a support broker perspective, is the ongoing input where we review, because I think Liz mentioned quite early on in our conversation today around the fact that plans need to be active and alive for people. They can't just be written once and printed on a document and forever referenced, because as human beings, we change. Our interests change, our, you know, our skills, our abilities change. And so we need to do that live planning thing that is continuous. You know, we're reviewing, we're checking into what needs to change. And often we see with people who've left hospital settings where they've been for a long time, they really thrive and flourish at a fast pace once they're in an environment that works for them. So their skills change really quick. They start being able to do things for themselves they've never been able to do in a hospital environment. And all of that stuff that's in their support plan needs to change because there's a shift, you know. So I think, again, the involvement of support broker post discharge and, you know, ongoing into their life in the community is a really key thing in making sure those plans still stay relevant, are still working for the person, and the person critically is going to stay out of hospital and be able to live in the community. Anything else around that one?
I think the kind of the bit about post-discharge is one to pick up on, Sarah, because you so often see people saying to failed discharges. So somebody moves from a hospital setting into a community setting and things are difficult, things are tricky, things are hard, there are unexpected bumps in the road that we don't always know are coming along. And if people were then able to lean back into a hospital team a little bit and say, actually, this is happening, maybe we can get some support, maybe we can get some guidance, maybe we can get some input to keep the person safe and well, rather than the assumption being it's all gone wrong, we'll have to go back to hospital. And just having that understanding that things will be difficult, and not everything will go smoothly as much as you can plan incredibly well. You won't always know what's coming up. So that kind of conversation around post-discharge support, I think, is something to really think about. And I guess from a support brokerage perspective, having those connections, having that understanding, being alongside the person through the first few weeks and maybe months after hospital discharge just allows you to keep bringing that information to people, doesn't it? And highlighting it and saying, you know, this is where things are struggling, what can we do about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And having that conversation in a way that it happens at the point that's most pertinent, rather than it being left and then things can then derail, you know. So it's about that responsiveness. Absolutely. I think the only two things that I'd cover and bring into this point as well is how important the person's voice is. I think one of the things that we bring as support brokers is a real understanding about how to build a relationship with people in such a way that their voice is heard. So we invest masses, sometimes, of time and energy around communication before we even start to have a planning conversation with someone. How does a person want to communicate? What kind of setting is best for them to be open and to be communicating? What resources, tools, approaches, communication aids can we build in to building that relationship so that we can be confident that when we're having the planning conversations and when we're representing what the person wants out of life, that we can do that with integrity and confidence, that it's a person's voice that's being heard. And I think that's the other point as well. And I know that we work in really complex settings at times with a lot of different people involved and a lot of different processes and legislative considerations to have that. But I think one of the key things where we bring a huge difference is this whole perspective of co-design and co-production, so that even in the MDT meetings, even in the ward rounds, in the CTRs, one of the key things that we bring into it is making sure that the person is present, the person is actively involved, and the person, where possible, is taking the lead, and that we create the conditions for that in the work that we do.
Should we have a look at principle 6? It leans into some of those thoughts. So
let's do that.
Join on. So principle 6, which is very similar to 4 and 5, but let's have a look at it. So the guidance says information should be shared effectively across relevant health and care teams and organisations across the system to support the best outcomes for the person. So I guess for me, the thing that really shouts out on here is around, I don't know if people know the Esther story, around sharing stories. So it was a model that was developed in Sweden, where Esther as a person, I think 1997 maybe, had to tell her story 32 times over the period of 10 hours, from the point of meeting a district nurse in the morning to being admitted to hospital in the afternoon. So 32 times she had to tell her story over that 10-hour gap. And this just really reminds me of that system where it's not working for people, you know, how unwell she must have felt having to tell her story that number of times just to get herself into a hospital bed where she needed medical support at the time. So for the people that we're supporting, who are adults with learning disabilities or maybe autistic adults who may be in a hospital for a number of weeks, months, sometimes years, we're talking about discharge planning, and those people who, as you said, Liz, may have reams and reams of assessments behind them, details about situations which have happened when they were well or less well, when they were younger than they are now, perhaps when their circumstances were different, and having to kind of introduce themselves to professionals and to anybody who's going to go on to support them along the way over the period of their life. And that sometimes haunts people, doesn't it? So somebody I'm working alongside currently says very clearly that the notes that have been made about me don't contain information that I wanted people to share, and they don't reflect who I am now. And yet that's on a system that's held kind of, and people will read that before meeting the person. So sharing information across settings just means that we don't have to have that repeating of information. We don't have to have the repeating of things that have been difficult, but actually we can focus on what matters to the person. And I guess that's the key point of this one for me. And I know that we've got a huge number of resources that we use along those discussion routes, and it might be worth linking to some of those. But particularly the kind of person-centered planning and making sure that the person's story is in a voice that is recognisable to them, being shared across the details of any professional that they may come into contact with. And it might be good to hear a little bit about the person-centered care and support planning training that we developed. I don't know if someone wants to comment on that one.
Yeah, there's a few things, isn't there, in that? I mean, a lot of what we do is talking into this principle specifically about the person's voice being prominent in what is shared about them. So there's a mechanism that comes from the NHS long-term plan and the universal personalised care model in the NHS, which is referred to as personalised care and support planning. And really the key principle about that is it's a central piece of information or set of information around the person, which anybody who is involved in elements of their care and support can access from a central place. It's a centralized storing of that information. It should be kept up to date. It should be added to whenever there's a change in circumstances, or if the person's preferences around how they're supported change, or the people they want to have influence or feed advocacy and all that kind of stuff is in there. But really it's a core place, a key place where all that information sits, and then people can access that on an as needed basis. It also sits really closely with the accessible information standards, which was a framework set up again within the NHS around accessibility of information for people. So it, for example, provides digital flags on systems so that when the person or the patient presents in a setting, when their name is put into the system, a flag comes up. This person has communication requirements. You need to make sure that information is provided to them in their preferred communication format. So whether that's using easy read information, whether that's they need to have somebody who can sign BSL or Makaton for them, whether that's they need their information in a different language because their first language is not English, that all of that is part of that personalized care and support planning stuff. So we've worked a lot around this particular subject, and we actually have developed a suite of online training which can be purchased and accessed via the Imagineer website. So that's probably something that would be of interest to people who want to learn more around how to develop really good personalised care and support plans for people. There's lots of detail that goes into that around things that we've already mentioned, like communication, like how to learn and gather information about who the person is, what their strengths are, what their preferences are for how they want to be supported. All of that stuff goes into the personalised care and support plan. So, and then there's all the stuff around the relational networks we talked about. So how to build a circle of support if the person doesn't have one. We can provide circles of support training if organisations are interested in that, or if a person wants to self-direct their own support using something like a direct payment or a personal health budget, we can work with them to set up their own circle of support and learn how that can be facilitated. So there's lots of additional resources and supports and training offers that we can provide around that stuff as well. Liz, did you want to add anything else into that?
Not really. I think you've covered that really well. And I mean, the suite of training that we have, if you think about the support brokerage, the personalised care and support planning training, the person-centred planning training, the content of them training courses covers a lot of what is mentioned here in the guidance. I think the only other thing really is that point that we touched on earlier, that if someone's been in the driving seat of developing their own plan, and therefore that plan is theirs, and it you know, the content of the plan they've curated and developed, and you know, it's something that represents them for who they are, not a document that maybe holds information that's inaccurate or maybe holds information about the past that they don't necessarily want to be reminded of constantly every time they see the document. That what we've experienced is a person with a plan that is theirs, that is person-centered, that is strength-based, that is about their good life. Then the person sharing it in a way that makes sense to them naturally, without it having to be an engineered situation. It's just something that naturally happens as a point of sharing the content of that plan. So yeah, I think that's the only other thing really, is to go back to say that for me, it's not always an indicator as to whether it's been a positive planning experience, and if it's been person-centered, if the person themselves is then sharing that plan.
Should we move on to principle 7? It's you
Let's
again,
do
Liz.
that. Are we on principle 7 now? Oh, we are.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so principle 7 in the guidance, local areas should build an infrastructure that supports safe and timely discharge, ensuring the right individualized support can be provided post discharge. So we've talked a little bit about this already throughout the conversation and this vlog around the work that we bring in support brokerage has a real focus around what life do you want? What does a good life look like? What does good support look like? And how can we work together to make that possible? And so that's a real connection in with principle 7. And part of the infrastructure then that we're stretching and maybe challenging at times is that element of commissioning and approved provider frameworks. So really the building of an infrastructure to really work in a really good way in this space would be actually to deconstitute one of the structures that we have so that we're moving away from predetermined commissioned providers to one where we have a plan that really helps to inform a bespoke individualized service design. And then we start to explore how we make that happen and how that can be funded. Does that make sense? That's funded as part of a personal health budget. Does it make sense that it's an individual service fund? Does it make sense that it's an independent commission? How can we work to make this possible? And I think the other element that we've talked about as well is around that a life isn't always about the service that someone receives. And actually some of this designing and developing individual support is a real lens on community space and doing some really good work around recognizing community, getting to know community, doing the mapping, being in community space, getting to know people and building relationships so that the wishes and aspirations, what does good support look like, can be found in that community space as well. And how you touched on this earlier, Sarah, and about circles of support, having intentional circles as part of the support network available to someone can be a really useful group of people to have around to do some of that exploration around what's working, what isn't working. What do you want to try next? Who do you want to connect in with? And widening the connections through the circle of support as well. So I think we need to, I think the guidance here and the principles around build an infrastructure. The infrastructure absolutely needs to be there because we need to have a wider lens of how we do things, but to be really conscientious of not taking the structure that's within statutory provision and expecting that to work in community space, because as soon as we try and bring that kind of structure in community space, we run the risk of destroying the natural connections that can occur in community. And I think that's why it's so important to have, like you were saying, Jo, that bridge between being able to know when to shift into community and work with a community perspective without bringing the statutory ways of doing things into that space. And I think one of the key things we've learned as well, the end of this here, the right individual support can be provided post-discharge. Sometimes the best arrangements are designed and developed when the support can start to happen before discharge, so that when the person's still in the hospital, they're having an opportunity to be part of the recruitment process for their new support team. They're part of the process of selecting and getting to know people. Then relationships begin to build in that space so that trust and knowledge can begin to grow, so that when the discharge happens, someone's moving out of hospital with the connections already in place that they're going to have outside hospital, rather than being faced with a sudden change of environment, a sudden change of place, and having to be overwhelmed by getting to know a lot of people all at once, which can be detrimental. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, I think for me, there's something in that around going back to the infrastructure part of the principle. I think there's something around flexibility. So, like you were saying, Liz, about it not having that really rigid statutory framework around it, like it does in the statutory service setting environment. But actually, when we're talking about community, we all do life in quite a fluid way, don't we, in the community? You know, I've got a dog, but actually I'm going away overnight, and the dog will be fine on its own overnight, but they'll need someone to take it out for a walk, maybe in the evening, and then feed it, and you know, pop in the next day to check it's okay and take it out for a little walk again. And actually I could ask my neighbour to do that. I don't have to pay a pet sitter or a dog walker necessarily. My neighbour might do that, or my mum might pop in and do that for me. And we would all do that very naturally as part of a community relational network, wouldn't we? But actually, when it comes to thinking about support for people who've been in hospital settings, we often just look at it through a service lens. And so it is really having that flexibility to open up the thinking, but also around how that support is designed needs to be flexible. And often when we think about design, we think about resource. And the resource is often about the money, isn't it? And then when we start to look at the money, we look at the commissioning rules or the procurement rules, or you know, all of that sort of stuff. So often this stuff is tied up around rules or rigid thinking around how things need to be procured, how things need to be commissioned. And sometimes it just needs a little bit of more open thinking around flexibility. So, you know, the mechanisms do already exist within our legal frameworks in adult social care, particularly around personal budget mechanisms, around individual service funds, around integrated budgets. You know, we've had lots of initiatives and policy drivers from the government over the last few years around this stuff. You know, what was the paper called, Liz, that we talked about? People, places, populations, the white paper.
Yeah.
That was all about working at a local level in an integrated way across services, working more with communities, all of that kind of stuff. So the imperative and the initiative is there to get it done. I just think that people are so ingrained in working in service-led ways that they've forgotten how to be flexible, or there's maybe a nervousness about what happens if we're flexible because there's no rigid parameters around it and we can't manage the risk as well. So I think, again, that's really where a support broker who's experienced in this kind of work can really add value into that commissioning conversation. Because if the person's getting stuck in hospital purely because that flexible thinking hasn't happened around what are some of the solutions we could create here, what are the options with resource, with funding, with housing options, with support options, how could we really creatively work in partnership across different services and agencies so that the solution appears for the person who is very stuck in hospital? And a lot of that, I think, is around commissioning conversations, and it's around what's available in the provider marketplace, what's not available. Often it's around pricing of stuff and what are our thresholds around budgets and all that kind of stuff. And so sometimes it just needs a bit of creative and flexible thinking, doesn't it? And again, support brokerage can really help unstick that rigid, inflexible thinking that happens, that gets people stuck. And we've definitely seen that in our work, haven't we? Where we bring those flexible approaches into the conversation, and actually things then start moving for the person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts, Jo?
I think that it's a difficult one, isn't it, when you talk about budgets and stuff? And I know the next principle is about funding, so I don't want to lean into it too much. But there's always a thing around, often these days, how cheap can we get it? How low cost can we get the service? And when providers maybe are stuck on delivering support in a very traditional model, it has to be shared support, or it has to be one-to-one support, or two-to-one support, or whatever they might look at it. Actually using budgets to deliver things that are not traditional support can be really impactful for people, can't it? So but using it to buy a resource, or to buy a piece of equipment, or to buy something that enables a person to be a bit more independent, rather than delivering it as traditional support. And that creates the infrastructure around them as an individual, doesn't it, to be able to live the life that they want to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a really good point, that actually the use of the budget can lead over time to a reduction of the requirement of a budget, if it's done in a really well considered way. And again, thinking about this from a lens of life, not service, strengths, not needs, relationships rather than paid support. So moving to relational rather than transactional. So if we can embed all this thinking really mindfully into the work that we do alongside people to help them get the life they want to lead, then yeah, you know, the benefits, we've seen the benefits across the board, haven't we? So not only first and foremost, absolutely the person's life, that's the driver, the person's life, and where they get to, where they've come from, and where they get to as a result of working in a different way. But the quality of the experience of providing support to the person in a paid capacity, so those people that work alongside the person quite often report that the quality of their life has improved, because the nature of the work is so much more purposeful and positive. Families quite often report feeling less stressed, concerned, less worried about the future, are pleased to see their family member in such a stronger position than where they were before. And ultimately, from a commissioning perspective, we have seen on quite a regular basis an approach that ultimately costs less on the public purse. So, I mean, what we're talking about is a win-win-win-win situation, because it's positive. We have them positive responses right across. Yeah. Okay, Jo, over to you. Principle number 8.
Principle 8. Can you believe we got to the end of the principles? So here's the last one for us to talk about today. So principle 8 says funding mechanisms for discharge should be agreed to achieve the best outcomes for people and their chosen carers, and should align with existing statutory duties. So we've got the little thing around language in this principle again, but if we ignore that little bit there around chosen carers, I think we're looking at support brokerage and the level of understanding that people have as support brokers around legal frameworks and processes, and how we can lean into that to kind of talk about funding responsibilities and options for individuals to find the best solutions. And that isn't always just about a commission service, as we know. So bringing knowledge in around a range of fundings, health budgets, personal budgets, individual service funds, managed accounts, are all ways in which people can continue to access funding to live the life that they choose to in a way that makes sense for them. And I think that's sometimes missing from conversations. Often when you talk to hospital discharge teams, it is around who's on the approved provider list for the local authority or the region or the area, however it's commissioned. Let's go to them and ask them what they can give us for this person, rather than saying this person needs whatever it might be, who can provide that? And those conversations just happen in the wrong frame, I guess, most of the time, don't they? And there might be a time pressure. There's obviously a lot of resource issues around discharge planning and the ways in which people can access services. But I guess support brokerage gives people the chance to do it differently. And that's often one of the taglines we use around working differently, thinking differently, working differently, and getting better outcomes for people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when we go through the support brokerage training, there's a section that we talk about, isn't there, around if we just have a lens on the statutory funding, whether that's a personal health budget, whether it's a personal budget, whether it's integrated, if we think collectively, when we're working with someone and their family about where to get to in life with just that as the sole resource to make that possible, we are being limiting in the possibility around the person. When we start to really open up and map all the resources potentially available to the person, what we're doing is we're beginning to widen the possibility. So it means that there isn't then this onus and dependence on everything being met from a statutory perspective. So we can look at other funding, we can look at the community, we can look at other resources, and we've done this. We know it works. We know that there are resources available, but that only works really well when the statutory resource is prepared to flex to be the bridge. Yeah. So if a statutory resource says you can only use the personal budget to pay for a PA, when through the work we've done with the person and the family, there's somebody in the community who will provide the support, but we need some funding to pay for the taxi, the transport, whatever else, the resource to get somewhere, then we're limiting the possibilities. So the statutory is not the only source of funding. We've a whole range of sources of funding, but statutory needs to be prepared to flex and be creative to make the most of what is there.
Absolutely.
Any thoughts, Sarah?
I think you've summed it up really neatly, both of you. I don't think I've got anything more to add to that. I just think it goes back to that really early open conversation. I think what often tends to happen in a crisis situation is the person needs to be supported. They need a placement or a service. So there's this panic conversation that goes on between often commissioning and the approved provider list, maybe the social worker, maybe the care coordinator. And actually, the whole conversation about what does a good life look like for the person has been forgotten about, because the focus is purely on we need to get the person discharged and they need to be supported for us to do that. And actually, where the support broker can help to flip the narrative and flip the lens on the conversation is to keep bringing people back to the good life conversation. We're not talking about a service, we're talking about the person having a good life outside a hospital. And by the person having a good life outside a hospital, hopefully over time their need for statutory services will reduce quite naturally, because they'll become integrated and embedded in their local community as a citizen with their own gifts and skills and contributions to bring, and actually their own relational networks will grow over time, and their need for paid support interventions should reduce. You know, we recognise some people will always need some form of paid service support, but there are so many different really personalised ways of doing that now for people. We don't need to start with what providers or what services are available, who's got a vacancy, who can support this person with their set of needs. So yeah, I think for me, the takeaway on that one is start with the good life conversation, then look at the resources that are available to make that good life happen, and then work out how those statutory mechanisms and functions that are available to the person can flex around that, to help build a really good life and really good support around the person in their community. And by doing that, hopefully the person stays out of hospital, which is what the end goal is, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we've had a really great, quite long set of conversations around these principles. I think it would be really good to just sum up and summarize. We're obviously talking about it from the perspective of how Imagineer can help to uphold these principles and support local authorities, ICBs, and organisations with making this stuff happen really well. We've already recognised a lot of this is already in other guidance and legal frameworks that already exist, and codes of practice and statutory guidance as well. but often the sticking point is around the making it happen stuff. And that's really where support brokerage makes a difference, because lots of people do the planning stuff, lots of people do the assessment stuff, lots of people do the commissioning procurement stuff. There's very little of the making it happen. And that's often where things get stuck, because nobody is driving that continuous movement to ensure things are happening for the person. So I think if we were to sum up everything we've been saying, it's that the role of the support broker in all of these principles and parts of the discharge process can really help to unstick that stuff that's getting stuck. And Imagineer provides that in a number of ways. So obviously we have a team of support brokers. We also provide training on lots of the elements we've talked about today, support brokerage being the primary one. So if you want to actually train and learn the approaches and practical techniques and tools and all of that kind of stuff around support brokerage, we offer support brokerage training. That's the first one. We've also talked about elements of support brokerage that we bring into those conversations and those practices. So there's things like person-centered planning, life planning, circles of support, all of those things that we've been talking about that are elements of support brokerage. We can also provide training courses on those different elements as well. And then if you go on our website and have a look, we've got loads of free resources as well. So starting off with the person-centered planning tools and the thinking tools and the conversation tools that we've made reference to, they're all free to download from the Imagineer website. You do just need to put your details in, but then you can get a free download. And there's a whole range of those available on the back end of our website. So go and have a poke around and look at those. There's some really good stuff. Each of our templates comes with an explainer video as well that talks you through how to use it and what it's suitable for. So there's text description, what is the tool, how do you use it, but then there's a video that you can watch with somebody, a member of our team, telling you how to use that tool. And then we've got things like our YouTube channel with lots of explainer videos on. We've got our vlog playlist, which this video will sit within, but there's lots of other vlogs with really great conversations with other people doing very similar aligned work, using the same principles and values and approaches as Imagineer. And we've got a newsletter that you can sign up for, and we've got social media channels as well. So we're on Facebook, LinkedIn, and X, formerly known as Twitter. We have channels on all of those platforms as well. So if you search at Imagineer CIC, you'll be able to find us on those 3 social media platforms. Have I missed anything, Liz and Jane?
We have got coming out soon, I think maybe next week or in the next couple of weeks anyway, the reports that yourself, Sarah and Joe have compiled as a conclusion of the projects that we've run with NHS England in providing support brokerage and life planning for people who have been sectioned into mental health hospital settings, and we've worked with people that have been commissioned from the 5 London regions, and them reports are a really valuable insight into the work that we have done alongside people in that space and the difference that that's made as well, and some of our own learning around the challenges and the barriers within the work. So I think for anybody who has been interested in what we talked about in this vlog, that would be a really good next point of reference to read more about the work that we do as well.
Yeah, definitely. And perhaps we'll link to those publications once they're available in the notes under this video as well, so that people can find them easily. So I think that probably concludes our brilliant conversation today. So thank you for staying with us if you've listened this far. We will also be breaking up this vlog into smaller content, bite-sized sections. So you may on our social media channels or in our newsletter see shorter versions where we refer to one of the principles within the guidance document as part of this longer vlog. But either way, we hope it's been useful for you. We hope that you'll check out the rest of our work, maybe sign up for our newsletter. And yeah, we hope that you'll continue having an interest in what we do, in helping people to take control of their lives and self-direct and live great lives as part of their community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.